Hey everybody, it's Kay. This is the KA show. So today we have a guest. His name is Eugene. Welcome, Eugene.
How are you?
Good. How are you doing?
I'm good. I'm quite well. Busy day.
Perfect. I'm really excited to have you on because you are from Bermuda. So it's going to be a different perspective. You know what I'm saying? I'm really excited to get your input on this topic.
All
So
right.
today what we're going to be talking about is higher education, college education, why it's important, different views that people have on it, and so forth. So first, I just kind of want to get into how do you feel about higher education? Do you think it's important? Do you think that's something that everyone should try to strive to do? What are just some of your general views about higher education?
Well, I think I have to start with a caveat. I'm college educated. I'm a lawyer. And so I understand what it's like to go postgraduate. I understand what it's like to be in classrooms, all different types of classrooms. And my experience tells me that the normal view, the view that education is important just to get a degree, getting the degree is important, is not really as important to me as it is to many people. And that may be because I've already been through university and I've got a degree and I have a profession and the rest of it. And I don't have the illusions that a lot of people have about education. I think what's more important than college education is a different type of education, one that builds character, one that builds discipline, and one that sets you in your community. And when you have that, that's the context that you use to either have higher education or to choose a different career path. So I wanted to start with that caveat because I think the caveat is important. It's one thing to go to school and get a degree and to say the degree is important, but it's really not unless it's rooted in something else, unless you use that degree to achieve some ends for your community, whatever that community is. So I wanted to start with that caveat.
Absolutely. I agree with what you're saying because you're kind of getting into the one of the points that we are going to talk about.
Mhm.
How are we supposed to use these degrees, right?
Right.
When are they useful? What is the point? Some people say they're a waste of money. Some people say, oh my goodness, now I have all these student loans and I'm still working at, wherever. It has nothing to do with what I even went to school for.
Mhm.
And I kind of want to specifically talk about in the Black community
Mhm.
how education is viewed, how college is viewed, how getting a degree is viewed. So I've heard, lots of different schools of thought on this. Some people are really pro go to school, get an education, do what you need to do, make sure it's in something useful. Some people are like, absolutely not. It's a scam. You're going to have a bunch of student loans and, you might not, it might not even be worth it in the end. So how do you feel about that?
I think that there's points on both sides of that question, isn't it? I
Mm.
think both views are valid. If you're going to school and you don't have a direction set when you start, if you set off to school and you want to do anything, you just want a degree, it's really problematic. But if you have a clear goal and you go, you can gauge the student debt or the expense of it with your purpose. A lot of people don't have a purpose, and therefore they try to find it in university or find it in school. And that's a very dangerous approach to take because you can get halfway through university, you can change your degree, you can change your idea of what you want to be when you grow up, and it looks very bleak. But if you have a purpose and you know where you're trying to go, it's a lot different. You can gauge it yourself, and it's not anybody else that can say this is worthwhile or not. It's for you to determine that based on the type of outcomes you're seeking and trying to get.
So you brought up an interesting point, which I agree with. Having that, excuse me, that foundation for how you set out on this path, right? You
Mhm.
kind of talked about that earlier with the caveat that you brought up. How
Mhm.
do you think that someone can get that foundation? Where does that come from? How do people become more equipped as 18-year-olds or however old you are when you enter college? How do you become more equipped with the knowledge of even how to go about doing that in a way that's going to be worthwhile and productive?
I think 18 is kind of late. I think we as a community have to do a better job of laying this foundation before people have to make this decision about university.
Mm-hmm.
A person should be able to determine what community they're part of and what function they're to play in that community long before they reach adulthood. And one of our problems as a community is it's that way here, and I know it's that way in the United States, and I know it's the way in Europe because I've been in all those places.
Yeah.
I know that we do a very poor job of acclimatizing people, our children, raising them culturally aware and as part of a Black community.
Yes.
One of the biggest difficulties that we have is that we attempt to put ourselves in the wider community. We don't consider ourselves a distinct and a Black community unless it's something negative. We only deal with our community when it's negative, but the positive aspects of community and culture and whatever, we say we're part of the wider social structure that we're part of. This is something I've noticed very much in the States. People generally talk as if, for instance, manhood is manhood, womanhood is womanhood. To be a child is the same for all communities. That's not reality. But we raise our children to believe that's reality, and then they get that rude awakening at 18, 19, sometimes after they come out of university, and they feel that the steps that they have taken don't make sense because they haven't made allowances for the type of environment they're part of and the way education is supposed to be used in their community.
Why do you think there's that disconnect? Why do you think that on one hand, a lot of us view ourselves as part of the broader community, whereas for certain things, like you mentioned earlier, we view ourselves as a Black community? What causes that disconnect?
Mainstream media, the wider community, the one that's controlled by Western or Eurocentric interest.
Mm-hmm.
It's in its interest to tell us in certain circumstances when it's most detrimental to us that we are part of this broader community. And this broader community is supposedly fair. You just have to work hard. You just have to get an education, get a STEM degree, and everything will be well for you. You just got to do the things that the Western or the Asian communities do, and you'll succeed. And it justifies when we don't get the same degrees or we don't have the same outcomes, then they say it's down to us and our cultural problems or our proclivity to not do the right things. So it's part of the mainstream media's, I guess, agenda to keep us off center about how we should be viewing ourselves, our identity, the way that we operate, who's our family. And so if you pick up that mainstream view and you adopt that, either because no one talks to you about a different view, either because you just go through life listening to the TV or the radio or songs or whatever it is, whatever other way the media reaches you, and you have no debriefing from at home or in your family, you have no cultural awareness, conscious awareness, then you would believe that we're all created equal and outcomes are down to effort. And when you don't see the same outcomes, you think something's wrong with you rather than something being wrong with the wider society in which we live.
Right. The system itself.
The system
right.
itself.
I see a lot of that conversation. I've had these conversations in real life. I see them online where we look at these gaps, whether it be achievement gaps, whether it be wealth gaps, all these different gaps between the Black community and, maybe the white community or the Asian community, all these other communities. And we see these huge gaps. So I've heard people say things like, we just need to get into these different types of majors, STEM, or we need to just get trades that pay more money, right? So that kind of makes me think of what you just said, because it's not as simple as just work hard and these gaps are going to close.
No.
Right? So how can we get that idea? How can we get more people to understand that concept that yes, we do have a lot of work to do, but we also have to recognize the larger system at play and figure out ways that we can build ourselves up so that we're not as negatively affected by these systems?
Well, I suspect it's easier in the states where Black people make up a teen percentage of the population to adopt the view that you're part of a wider community. And it'll be harder for persons that live in the states to see themselves as part of a distinct Black group when it comes to certain things.
Yeah.
Here, where Blacks are the majority populace, it's easier for us to see ourselves as part of that distinct group because we make up the majority.
Right.
But that leads to another issue that I sometimes hear discussed in the States. Sometimes it's discussed like you're a minority and the wealth gaps and the disparities that you're speaking about are down to the fact that you are a minority. So here's the rude awakening. Even in a place like this, where we make up the majority of the populace, the same disparities exist. Even if I can say the Black person in Bermuda probably makes per capita more proportionately than the Black person in the States. It's the truth. The data says that. When you compare us to white people who live in Bermuda, the gap is almost just as wide as it is in the States.
Oh, really? Even though the population is, even though Black people make up so much more of the population?
Exactly right. That's why I say sometimes living as a minority, and I've been in communities where you are a distinct minority. For instance, in London, it's almost 2% Blacks. So it's even less than in the States.
Yeah.
You take on a certain pattern of thought about your identity in the environment you're in. And sometimes you feel like if only we could have control of certain things, if only we could have a different demographic, things will look differently. But that's not the truth, because if we just spread our net wider, look at our communities, look at our family overseas and in different places, you realize that that disparity does not go away based on the proportion of the population that you represent. There is something else at play.
It's very interesting that you've lived in 3 different places where Black people make up differing amounts of the community. And you spoke on how in America, we view ourselves as part of a larger community when it comes to things like education. Like we can just go to school and maybe we can reach this level if, enough of us do this or that. Personally, and I just want to kind of talk about this because I am a huge supporter of people going to college, of people, getting higher education, doing more things in terms of just different career fields, simply because we need more Black people in these career fields. And the only way to get more Black people in these fields is for them to go to college for it. So like, I know that I've said this, before, but even though I absolutely believe that we need to do that, I am not thinking that if every Black person even goes to college, that gap is going to close in a way that is going to be substantial. Like there will still be that gap there. So I guess the question is, what is the solution when it comes to like our attitudes towards education? I am actually a teacher. Most people don't know that, but I'm a teacher. So I see kids getting educated every day, in the K-12 setting. There are huge disparities between Black people in the inner city and white people in the suburbs, right? And that kind of goes back to what you were saying, like in the beginning of the conversation, just the foundation that people have with how they look at education. So how can we get this mindset where K-12 is even seen as more vital, so that by the time kids get to be 18, they have a strong, solid foundation. They maybe even have like a direction that they want to go, so that they can carry it through. Because I know we talk about STEM fields, getting into the STEM field, but let's say you want to be a teacher, you want to be a social worker, you want to be, a lawyer. None of those are STEM. But if you have a clear path for what you want to do, you will be able to utilize those degrees in a way that's going to make you successful.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like it's kind of it's incorrect to just say we only need to focus on STEM. There are so many areas that are important, in terms of higher education and career paths that we can take as Black people.
Right.
So when we're talking about this STEM situation, how do you feel about that? The STEM degrees versus the humanities?
It's funny. I heard people talking about STEM degrees. In a place like this, a STEM degree would get you pretty much nowhere.
Really?
Because we are a what you call it, a risk capital, the risk capital of the world. Insurance, reassurance, law, all these financial fields, they're not STEM based.
Right.
And being in a community like this, if you was to go into a STEM career like engineering or whatever, you'd be poor. So it tells me that the environment and the community you're in should determine what degrees you should pursue and what functions you should try to perform after you're finished school. It's not simply because the Asians do it, I have to go out and get a STEM degree. It's not simply because I think it pays more, do I go out and get a STEM degree. The first question is, what community are you part of? What does that distinct community require 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now? How much effort do I have to put in to getting those skills? What must I do to get them? What are the options or the roads available for me to take to get those degrees and those qualifications and those skills? And how do I get that? That's basically it. The fundamental question is, what does your own distinct community require in the time you're in? You don't look at white people, for instance, and say, there's a lot of people on Wall Street, I need to get into Wall Street. Or there's a lot of social media influencers, I need to be one. Or there's a lot of engineers and doctors, I need to be one. You should take an assessment of your own home's needs.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't mean home in terms of household, I mean community, your own family, broader community's needs. What do we need? Not just in America, but in other places where we exist.
Mm-hmm.
And how do I get those skills, not some other skills? For instance, the Japanese example was, and this sounds kind of cruel, but the Japanese example was after the war and after they were decimated, they would line children up. And they would say, I don't know if there's any Japanese names, but here, you're going to do this thing. Mm-hmm. You're going to be a doctor. And they would do it out like a telly. And it might sound strange to us. It might sound like it steps on rights and your own dignity as a person, your freedoms and whatever. But in the long run, now we have a whole workforce, a whole community of people who satisfy all the needs of our community, and they don't just go on their own individual whims. See, part of the problem is we go on our own individual whims. We feel like I think I have a passion for something, so I do it, but I haven't even assessed that passion against needs of my community. So this is the type of education we need first, I say it in the caveat.
Yeah.
We need the type of grounding education before we do the schooling. Mm-hmm. Because the grounding education is the fulcrum from which we can judge everything. So my view about STEM, it's good, but it might not be as good for us as it's good for others. We may need nurses. We may need doctors. We may need lawyers. We might need journalists and social media influencers. We might need people behind television screens. Yeah. Who knows? But that question has to be asked genuinely and answered authentically before you can start talking about what degree is right and wrong, good and proper.
Agreed. I 100% agree with that, because I think while STEM degrees, I mean, they're great. We need people in STEM, absolutely. Mm-hmm. But I kind of think it's more of a frantic, like, oh my goodness, STEM makes money. Other people are doing STEM. Let's do STEM. That's the most important thing. Like, we got to do it. But we really need to think about what's needed and how do we get people to the point where they're utilizing any degree that they get to be useful in the community, to make money, to make to play their part in the whole, right?
Mhm,
The
mhm.
whole of the Black community.
Yeah,
What are we doing as individuals to make it better?
right.
Um, this part. So there's also lots of talk around finding mates in college and STEM degrees being the more worthwhile ones. A lot of people think that. And that other ones are kind of just a waste of time, especially for women, right? So some people have this view that if you are a woman and you're not focused on STEM, you might as well spend those younger years, looking for a husband, spend that time searching for a mate instead of searching for a career or searching for, a degree. And I'm not saying that anyone is saying women don't get degrees or don't get a job. But I'm saying a lot of people think that those younger years where you would usually be in undergrad or maybe grad school should kind of be spent solidifying your place as someone's wife. What do you think about that?
I think I'm back to the caveat. I think I'm back to the caveat. And I think I'm back to education in that sense again.
Mm-hmm.
The proper education before you do schooling answers these questions too. So when I was last in giving a talk to a group of people in Washington, PG County, I was out there giving a talk. And I'm talking about some esoteric African stuff,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like I'm going to talk to them about some cultural things. And when we came to the question and answer portion, this is what shocked me. Instead of asking questions about what I was talking about, the only thing they were interested in was how did I find a wife who would stand beside me while I press a certain agenda, who can take like the ups and downs of relationships and marriage, who can, go from having a lot of money to having no money to having a lot of money again. And, how do you find a woman like that? And I realized, oh, wow, out here in PG County, out here in Washington, there is a problem between black males and black females that's pretty acute. Now, you find the same problem almost everywhere we exist, by the way. But I thought there's a strangeness to this. There's people who are really desperate to find a certain type of mate, but they don't know they don't know what you're supposed to be looking for. You don't know what foundation you're supposed to be targeting, like the criteria you're supposed to be looking for. They know none of that. They think you go to college, and because you're both, basically an undergrad or grad or postgrad, you think aligned. You're aligned in thought. And if you find somebody who's attractive in that environment, and you then bed them, and then go down on the knee and put a ring on the finger, you would have a wonderful marriage. And this is a fiction. It's not reality. The truth is, that's the reason why I say go back to the caveat.
Mm-hmm.
If you've got a certain conscious grounding, identity as part of a black community, it's very easy to identify mates who have that same grounding and those who don't. It stands out like a sore thumb. And that foundation, that purpose that you have and trying to advance your own community and not being concerned about anybody else is actually a decent foundation for a sensible relationship, right? Everybody's on point. You got to say nothing. I don't have to say to my wife, for instance, you know about this black thing, this black stuff. You know we're conscious. You know we're going to raise our children to understand that they're African. I ain't got to say none of that to my wife. I ain't got to have that discussion because I already know if I'm walking in a particular way and having a certain rootedness when I see her, that discussion is not necessary. Now, my wife's a lawyer too. So that should also say something.
Yeah.
None of us went to school to find each other. I went to school to get a law degree. And she came to school to get a law degree. And if I would have been caught up in my wife, and she would have been caught up in me, and neither of us would have got a law degree, we would have wasted our money. We wouldn't have a good marriage. We wouldn't have nothing. Our foundation would be.
I
right?
agree. You know what? I think that's my philosophy too.
You focus on
Focus.
what you go for,
Yep.
and the side effects or the byproducts of you walking a particular way, carrying yourself a particular way, being very clear about what you want out of life and what function you're supposed to play, puts you in alignment with people who have similar ideologies. There's differences, of course, uniqueness to all of us, but similar ideologies, which is the root of good relationships. So we come to college, most people go to college, they don't even know what degree they want to be part of, and the reason why they're there. And they see somebody that they find attractive, the breasts are large, the behind is swollen. I'm gonna make a wife out of her, right?
Right.
And that's just not how these things work. That's also miseducation, because the type of education we need is also about how to be a proper partner, how to be a husband, how to be a wife, how to be an adult, because there's a huge difference between being a child and being an adult. And this type of education we don't get. So sometimes without that education, we go off to university as children, come back as children with degrees and partners.